few years ago, I stayed with my girlfriend at her dad's house for a month. His property stretched over many acres, surrounded by dense woods on one side and a lake on the other. The place was remote, quiet, and full of isolated trails. One trail, a thin, narrow path through the woods, had become my escape whenever I needed to clear my head. One day, an unusually thick fog settled over everything, more intense than anything I'd ever seen. The mist hung low, hiding the trees like a shroud, so thick that I couldn't see more than 15 feet ahead. Feeling drawn to it, I put on my hiking boots, told my girlfriend I'd be back soon, and headed into the woods alone. Something I often did, as she didn't enjoy walking in the trees as much as I did. Stepping into the clearing, I felt an odd silence. Even the sounds of the woods seemed swallowed by the fog. Each step felt like it echoed, like something, or someone, was matching my pace. I paused, looked around, and called out, "Hello?" My voice vanished into the mist, and there was no answer, no more footsteps. Assured I was alone, I continued on. But the deeper I went, the stranger it became. There was a muffled moaning, like the sound of someone in pain, a low, trembling noise that sent chills down my spine. This was private property, no one else should be here. Yet the moaning continued, coming from somewhere in the fog. I walked toward it, calling out again, "Hello? Are you okay?" That's when I saw it. A figure, looming just at the edge of my vision, tall and barely visible in the thick haze. I took a few steps closer, hoping to see better, but no matter how far I walked, the figure remained the same distance away. The moaning had stopped, replaced by silence, and my heartbeat thundered in my ears. I called out again, but the figure only stood there, unmoving. Finally, something snapped inside me, and I turned and started walking briskly back toward the house. A few seconds later, I glanced over my shoulder and froze. The figure was still there, now following me, keeping the same distance as before. I quickened my pace, but each time I looked back, the shadowy shape kept up effortlessly, like it was gliding over the ground. Its legs weren't visible. It seemed to hover, weightless, an unnatural silhouette against the fog. I broke into a run, sprinting as fast as I could toward the yard. Every time I dared to look back, that figure floated just at the edge of my vision, never getting closer, never falling back. Finally, I stumbled out of the woods, breathless, back into the clearing around the house. I glanced one last time toward the tree line, and to my horror, saw it lingering there, watching. I burst through the back door, slamming it shut, startling my girlfriend, her dad, and her brother. Between gasps, I tried to explain, pointing into the fog, telling them about the figure that had followed me, the moaning, the impossible pursuit. Her dad put on his shoes and went out with me to check. We looked toward the tree line where I'd last seen it, but there was nothing, just fog. He patted my shoulder, laughed it off, and assured me that with both of us and the 2 dogs, no one would dare intrude. I laughed too, trying to hide the fear that still clenched at me. I'm not one to believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, but that experience haunts me even now. It felt as close to a true encounter with the unknown as I ever hoped to get. While I was moving from my parents' place in Staten Island to Manhattan, I relied on apps like Craigslist and Letgo to find affordable furniture. I'd already secured my new apartment, but I was still finishing the move and spending most nights back at my parents' place. One night, I found a nice, cheap dresser on Letgo that matched the rest of my furniture. The seller, a guy named Jake, responded quickly to my messages, and we arranged to meet outside his place, which was on a dead end near Little Park. Jake mentioned he worked late, so we agreed on 10:30 p.m. as the meeting time. I decided to get there a bit early because the later it got, the stranger it would feel. When I pulled up around 10:15, the street was covered in a thick fog, so dense I could barely see if there were any other cars. Almost the instant I parked, I received a message from Jake. "You're early. Just give me a second. I'll be right out." It was strange. How did he know I'd just arrived? The fog was so heavy it was impossible to see anything clearly, replying with, "Okay." I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. It dawned on me that this wasn't an ordinary street. There were no typical houses here, just a few indistinct buildings shrouded in fog. After a moment, Jake sent another message. "Come on out. The dresser's waiting out back." That made me hesitate. Back where? I couldn't see any clear path. I got out of my car and replied, asking him where exactly to go, but he stopped responding. Instead, I started hearing his voice, faint but calling out, "Over here." With the dense fog and darkness, I felt like I was stepping into a horror movie. Still, I followed his voice, calling back, "I'm coming," as I squeezed through a narrow alley between two buildings. On the other side of the alley was a sort of backyard, though I couldn't gauge its size because the fog limited my vision to just a few feet. And then, silence. No more calls from Jake, only the far-off hum of traffic. Every instinct told me something was wrong. I began to back away, ready to leave, when I heard his voice again saying, "Wait, the dresser's just inside here. Come on in." His voice seemed close, but I couldn't see him. I didn't respond. I just started backing toward the alley. Then I turned and froze. Through the fog, I could just make out figures standing against a wall or fence, motionless as if waiting. That was it. I bolted back through the alley, and almost immediately, I heard footsteps behind me, fast and closing in. At least 3 people were chasing me. Realizing I didn't have time to reach my truck and get away, I ran down the street until I was out of breath. Desperate, I called the police. Minutes later, 2 police cars arrived. I flagged them down, and one officer let me in the car while they checked out the location I'd just escaped from. When they searched the yard area, it was empty. Both buildings were abandoned storefronts, the back door wide open, leading into nothing but empty rooms. And of course, no dresser was there. I showed the officers my let-go conversation with Jake and gave them the account information, hoping they'd investigate. But nothing ever came of it. I don't know if the police followed up at all. All I know is that if I'd gone inside that building, something very bad would have happened to me. Last Saturday was an incredibly foggy day. My family and I were quarantined at our place in Jersey. My wife was out shopping, my son was in his room, and I was in my office trying to get some work done when my 6-year-old daughter, Veronica, walked in, saying she'd seen someone in the garden. I followed her to the window and looked out over the backyard. She was right. There was someone standing in the middle of the garden. Their back was to us, and with the fog so thick, I couldn't even tell if it was a man or a woman. I knocked on the glass to scare them off, and the figure turned their head before walking further into the fog until they vanished from view. I told Veronica to stay inside, slipped on my shoes, and went out into the yard, heading in the direction where I'd last seen the person. Living as far out as we do, it's unsettling to find anyone wandering around the property, so my instinct was to follow and make sure they were gone. As I moved closer to the shed, I began hearing a dull, rhythmic thumping. When the shed came into view, I could see someone standing at its door, repeatedly slamming it shut. I shouted, "Get out of here before I call the police!" Moving closer, I saw it was a middle-aged woman, looking unkempt and out of place. She muttered, "Sorry," over and over, then took off running toward the road, disappearing quickly into the fog. That night, after my wife and I had gone to bed and the house was silent, I was jolted awake by a familiar noise. The steady, repetitive sound of the shed door slamming again. My wife, half awake and alarmed, urged me to go out and scare them off. I hadn't told her about the woman from earlier. I didn't want to frighten her. I slipped on my shoes, grabbed a flashlight, and turned on all the backyard lights. I went outside, yelling into the fog as I approached the shed. The slamming stopped abruptly. The shed door was wide open, but no one was around. Heart pounding, I forced myself to go inside. The shed was empty, so I shut the door, twisted the lock, shouted another warning about the police, and headed back inside. As I was walking to my bedroom, Veronica came up to me, teary-eyed. "What's wrong?" I asked, concerned. She looked up at me, saying, "Look out my window." My heart skipped. I rushed to her room, keeping the light off, and looked out her window. Standing right outside, trying to open it, was the same woman. This time, I could see her face clearly. It was horrifying. Her skin sagged, cracked and worn, and her wiry gray hair framed a face with discolored, rotting teeth. She looked sick, unhinged. There was no question that she was a threat. I yelled for her to leave, ran for the phone, and called 911. By the time I looked back out the window, she had vanished. The police came but didn't find much to go on besides taking down a report. They said they'd alert other patrols in the area, but it didn't bring much comfort. It's been less than a week, and yesterday morning I noticed the shed door was left wide open again. I have this growing fear that one night soon, I'll wake up and find her inside the house.